couple things, Jerry, before we really get started. Number one, I have a copy of the book you wrote with Andy, well, the first one, Mississippi Politics, Struggle and Power, sitting on there on my desk next to my drawing board. It's one of my go-tos, and so it is a particular honor for me to be able to sit here today and talk to you, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Here, let's pull that microphone a little closer to you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you don't have to lean over, because I would fall off the chair. I tell you, it is like I said, this book is fantastic. You're in for a treat. Let me kind of talk a little bit real quick. And just thinking about Reconstruction, you know, and I was the sixth integrated class in Cobb County Public Schools in Marietta, Georgia. Yeah, I know, I'm a Yankee. Literally the first speech I gave in Mississippi, I said I was from Atlanta, and a lady said, yeah, you're not from around here, you're a Yankee. And I said, Sherman burned my town down too. I should get some credit here. But, you know, I remember, you know, literally Sherman's headquarters for the Battle of Atlanta was across the street. I knew where every battleground was. I had walked the battlegrounds and everything else. I learned very little about Reconstruction. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, because I think there was probably some reasoning behind that when they created the curriculum. But one of the things I did enjoy about the book was, number one, I learned a lot about Mississippi in the same time too, because there's a statue of a guy down the street on the bench, Faulkner's his name, I think it is. He had a couple quotes. The past is never dead, it's not even past. And then to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. And those were two things that came to mind when I started reading your book.
So, first off, if I can divert just a little bit from the question, I want to thank Square Books for hosting our event tonight, Jude, and I think independent booksellers deserve a round of applause.
Amen.
For us tonight. Jude, thank you. And Marshall, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
The first time I remember hearing the word Reconstruction was in November of 1986. I was helping Mike Espy in his election for Congress, and after he won in November, some of you may remember all of the media reports were saying Mike Espy, the first black congressman from Mississippi since Reconstruction. And I read that. I remember reading that, Marshall, and thinking, I wonder what that means. And of course, back then, we couldn't pick up our phone and say, Siri, tell me who the first black congressman was from Mississippi, and just sort of forgot about it. And then Andy and I started writing this book, the one you referenced, the history of contemporary Mississippi politics. And we wanted to try to understand why 1976 was the last year Mississippians voted for a Democratic presidential candidate. And to do that, Marshall, we had to understand the history of the Republican Party and the history of the Democratic Party. So I started interviewing all of the founders of the modern-day Republican Party. Wirt Yeager and Billy Munger and Clark Reed and Buddy Clum, Victor Mavar. And every one of them told me a story that was similar to the one that Buddy Clum told me that he experienced in Copiah County in 1956. He was the first treasurer of the modern day party. And he went, if you're going to create a party, you got to have people run for office, right? So he decided to go to the Copiah County Courthouse in 1956 and run for election commissioner. He, of course, was going to run as a Republican. So he went to the desk and told the woman there that he wanted to run for office, and she pulled out a form for him to fill out, blank space for his name, blank space for the position he was seeking. But then when it came time for him to indicate his political party, the form had already been pre-printed Democratic Party. And Marshall, he said, well, ma'am, I want to run as a Republican. And she said, what? I want to run as a Republican. And she said, I got to go get the man. She ran down to go get the circuit clerk. He came running up to the desk. And he said, Mr. Clum, you want to do what? I want to run as a Republican. And he said, well, Mr. Clum, didn't you know that Republicans are the ones who gave black men the right to vote during Reconstruction? Don't you know that it was Republicans who imposed military control on Mississippi during Reconstruction? Don't you know, Mr. Clum, it was Republicans who freed the slaves? And to Buddy Clum's great credit, he said, well, no, sir, I didn't know all of that, but I still want to run as a Republican. And every one of the guys I interviewed had similar stories of white Democrats in this message about Republicans and what they did during Reconstruction. And, you know, this was 80 years later. So that began this quest to try and understand what Reconstruction was all about. Some of you may know that the volume on Reconstruction is part of a Heritage of Mississippi series of 14 or 15 volumes of different periods of Mississippi history. And at the time I started doing all of this, a number of volumes had been chosen except Reconstruction. And in a weak moment, the committee decided to let me do it and signed a contract to try and understand what Reconstruction was, and that was 10 years ago. So this has been a 10-year labor of love to try and figure out what 10 years after the Civil War was like.
You know, seriously, when you think about you're attacking this, I mean, so much of your book is primary sources because everything that had been written about it was pretty much propaganda.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is the textbook that I grew up with in Greenville, Mississippi. John K. Bettersworth, who wrote edition after edition, trying to continue a number of myths about Mississippi history. And this is the opening of the chapter on Reconstruction. The war was over, Marshall, but the fighting was not. Reconstruction was a worse battle than the war ever had been. Now, mind you, 620,000 people had died during the Civil War. An entire section of the country had been destroyed. And Bettersworth is writing that Reconstruction was worse than that.
I do like the fact that he put my name in there, though. That was very nice.
There you go.
Yeah, that was great. I will say this, though. You had a very good line in the book, something to the tune of, whereas during the Civil War, there are markers that show the battlefields, but for Reconstruction, there aren't.
That's right. The battlefields in Reconstruction were precincts, were election campaigns, and battlefields, the other battlefields were businesses and plantations and farms where newly freed black men, women, and children had to come to terms with working with whites who had at one time enslaved them. And it was one battle after another. I need to interrupt and say one thing very quickly because I'm fixing to put a lozenge in my mouth. I am old and worn out. And so in order for me to continue this conversation without getting hoarse, I have to take these throat lozenges. So every time you see me put one of these lozenges in my mouth, Cecil Brown is over here thinking, oh my God, he's going to keep talking. So next time you see me put a lozenge in my mouth, if we need to sort of change topics or talk about something else, just raise your hand and I'll know to switch. So here we go.
I am glad that we have a Boys of Spring seating section up here in the front. That's pretty awesome, to say the least. And by the way, yeah, I have the same thing. This is just vodka, so it works out very well. Delicious. You know, on the primary sources, real quick, and just talk about where you did your research. 10 years to do this, and you were having to dig. I know, like the Freedmen Bureau, for instance, the National Archives has like almost every single word that was ever written by them is in there. So there were a lot of places for you to go, but what were some of the major primary sources that you had?
Well, what was fascinating about this particular period of American history, certainly Mississippi history, is that it was so well documented by writers of the time. There were a whole raft of reporters who came to the South in the years after the war documenting what it was like. And all of those materials still exist and you can get. Union soldiers wrote thousands of letters from Mississippi and other parts of the South documenting what they were finding. Missionaries from organizations in the North sent people to the South to educate and to help the newly freed black men, women, and children. All of their memoirs are still around. The federal government, Congress, had congressional committees here all the time documenting what was happening, and all of that is still available. And then Marshall mentions the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was the first time in American history that the federal government decided to create an agency to actually help somebody. It was the first, again, just using a word that everybody knows, the first attempt at a social welfare or modern day FEMA, if you will. It lasted for 6 years, and millions of documents from that time are in the National Archives. Most of it is handwritten. And I don't know about y'all if you've ever looked at letters and memoirs that were written during this particular time, but it is something that I cannot read because of this flowery script that everybody used. But a collection of scholars in Maryland decided to go into the archives. They paid to have all of these letters and reports transcribed. Then they read through them and culled out 50,000 annotated documents that they then annotated into 6 volumes, which total about 9,000 pages. So what you're buying today, hopefully,
no, you are buying it.
is about 100 pages filled with selections from 9,000 pages, which is filled from millions of documents in the National Archives. But it's all of these documents are a wonderful contemporaneous portrait of what the times were like. And once you're confronted with all of that material, it's pretty easy to write a book.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I really liked about the book. Number one, like I said, it's meticulously researched. It's beautifully written. You give such a painting. You start 1862, right? So that's literally a pivotal point in the Civil War.
Right.
That's when Grant and Sherman are running around Mississippi trying to do 2 choke points, Corinth and Vicksburg later. But it's such an important, you give such a good, accurate picture of what the state was like at that point. I mean, we think about we're rural now, right? Just imagine a time before Dollar Generals and 8% of the people in the state of Mississippi, they lived in towns, but everybody else lived out in the country. So it was kind of a wild time. And as the Union Army was going around, they were freeing people at that time too, weren't they? Free being kind of a loaded word.
Right.
Yeah.
Marshall has given me an entree to talk about the most important thing I learned in writing the book. All of us here sort of think of Reconstruction as what it took for Mississippi to, quote, re-enter the Union.
Right.
Now, I'll ask this rhetorical question. When Mississippi, quote, seceded from the Union in January of 1861, actually, I will ask you this, and, quote, rejoined the Union in January of 1870, those 9 years. The people who wrote the documents to secede from the Union actually thought they were leaving the federal government. They thought they were leaving this American experiment and going to do something else. So if that's the case, if Mississippi left the Union for 9 years, when we celebrated the 200th anniversary of Mississippi in December of 2017, was it 9 years too early?
Well, no, because the Supreme Court shot down their theory.
Just because you read my book. Now,
honestly, I had no idea of that, to be honest with you, so no.
He stole my line, but that's all right.
I'm sorry.
I know.
I'm a terrible host.
No.
I apologize.
So in 1869, the Supreme Court ruled that being a state in the Union is takes two to tango.
Yeah.
That a state cannot unilaterally leave, that federal government has to approve that. But who did leave were Mississippi's 2 U.S. senators, Jefferson Davis, Albert Brown, and its 5 members of Congress. They left to attend the secession convention in 1861. And under the Constitution, the Senate and the House have near unilateral determination as to requirements to seat their members. So the Republicans in Congress decided that in order for a state like Mississippi to be able to send 2 senators and members of Congress back to the Capitol, over time they had to do a number of things. They had to adopt a constitution that prohibited slavery and a number of other requirements. They had to confirm the 14th and 15th Amendments, and they had to give black men the right to vote. Once they did those things, which Mississippi did by January of 1870, then they could be readmitted. Now that's sort of what we think of Reconstruction, and that's all described in the book. But what became clear to me in doing all of this reading and thinking about the times was that what Reconstruction was really about was about freedom. It was about a time in the country's history when 4 million black men, women, and children gained their freedom, something they had never had their entire lives. And many people will make the case that it's the first time that America ever confronted what it meant to be free in America. As a congressman said on the floor of the House in debating Freedmen's Bureau legislation, what is freedom? Is it the mere absence of slavery, or is it something else? And Marshall, we've been debating that question ever since. Every time we do July the 4th celebrations and we celebrate freedom, we rarely think about what does it mean to be free in America? Well, black families in Mississippi pretty quickly came to the realization and the consensus that in order to be free in Mississippi after the war, they needed 3 things: the right to vote, the right to an education, and the right to own land. And so the book is an exploration of how successful or unsuccessful those 3 things came to be over the 10 years. Sort of the tension between blacks and whites, and how much of it resulted in freedom and how much of it didn't. But this is where this idea of freedom, or the meaning of freedom, began to take place. And it is a contemporary topic today about what it means to be free in America. And black men and women confronted that and fought for it as bravely as people have ever fought for it from 1865 to 1875.
Yeah, I've mentioned the history rhyming thing. You think about you had a president named Johnson. You just so many parallels to what happened 100 years later was incredible. But the thing that I think was sad, the way you've got it structured through the years, you have this movement, you have these progressive things. Number one, it established public schools in Mississippi when they came up with the Constitution. There were a lot of things good that happened, and then suddenly things started going awry and going away.
If you had to choose one of those 3 freedoms that black men and women settled on in the years during Reconstruction, and you read reports of missionaries who started schools for black men, women, and children, and you read reports of Union soldiers who witnessed these schools being started, what becomes pretty clear is that of those 3, education was viewed by black men and women as the single most important thing that they needed to do, because they were prohibited from gaining an education during slavery. They were prohibited legally in the slave code from being able to read a book. And as many of you can appreciate, the one book that black men and women wanted to read to their children was the Bible. And that's the first thing that missionaries started doing, was creating classes for black men and women to learn how to read so they could read the Bible to their children. So when black men gained the right to vote, created a coalition with white Republicans, had control of the 1868 Constitution, the single most important article of that Constitution was the creation of the state's first comprehensive statewide public education system. And when you read that 1868-1869 Constitution, of the 12 or 13 articles in the Constitution, the one on education is the only one, Marshall, that has a preamble, because they wanted to stipulate why this was so important, why education was fundamental to casting an informed vote, why education was fundamental to being able to sign documents to own land, why education was fundamental to be able to adequately farm and understand labor contracts. And that's why public education was so important. That's why they mandated it in the 1869 Constitution. And I go into great detail during the 1870 legislative session when they sort of implemented that constitutional provision and started the education system. And just to make a final point, as many of you will appreciate, it's the one feature of the 1869 Constitution that white voters kept in the 1890 Constitution, because it wasn't just black children who were taking advantage of this comprehensive statewide public education system, but it was white children as well. White children who had never had access to education prior to the war, and it was so popular that it was the one feature of the Constitution that was maintained.
There are a lot of characters in the book and a lot of people that you could talk about, but one of them, literally, his house is just up the street. We've got a local one that Lucius Q.C. Lamar on that, and how he, by doing an obituary, was able to reframe how the Civil War, that story was told. Tell that story, Jere.
Jude, do I have time to tell this story, or are we bumping up against something?
About 5 minutes.
You've got about 8 minutes.
8 minutes. Thanks. See you there.
I was just leaving room for questions and answers.
Right.
But
So the most important reason out of many important reasons that I'm grateful for Square Books hosting this conversation is that I wanted to come to Oxford and I wanted to talk about LQC Lamar. I wanted to wander into the den, if you will, because other than Jefferson Davis at the time, Lamar was probably the most well-known Mississippi Democratic politician. Very, very smart. Known more or less because he's the only Mississippian who served in the U.S. House, served in the U.S. Senate, was a federal cabinet official, and justice on the Supreme Court. And incredibly influential. And it was Lamar who sort of crafted the message of Reconstruction. And I'm one of these guys who believe that whoever controls the message controls the political outcome. And Lamar, who wanted white Democrats like himself to regain control of state government from the coalition of black and white Republicans during Reconstruction, had to craft a rationale for how that could happen and how it could be justified. And his very brilliant and nuanced approach was given to him in March and April of 1864 when Charles Sumner died. Charles Sumner, who was viewed as the devil incarnate by white Democrats in Mississippi, senator from Massachusetts. And when he died in March of 1864, the Mississippi legislature was in session, at the time controlled by Republicans, black and white majority. And they spent several days eulogizing Sumner. 13 pages from the House and Senate Journal contained their speeches, and they carved out a portion of northeast Mississippi and created a new county, named it Sumner County, which is now Webster County, but back then it was called Sumner County in his honor. And Lamar saw his opportunity because in April on the floor of the House, Lamar was back in Congress, they were going to take a day to eulogize Charles Sumner. And Lamar saw his opportunity to stand up and give a speech in honor of Sumner and praise Sumner in a very nuanced way that was not picked up at the time, but that earned Lamar accolades all over the country for years and years because of his seemingly unresolved, speech without any sort of anger toward Sumner. And it was so well remembered that when John Kennedy published this book as a senator from Massachusetts in the 1950s, written by a speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, there's a whole chapter in here on Lamar, Profiles in Courage. And it's all about Lamar's speech eulogizing Sumner. Lamar had to figure out a way to craft a message that would create common cause between white Southerners and white Northerners. And he did that by admitting defeat, but never admitting what they did was wrong. So the historical memory of the Civil War for generations after generations after generations of white Mississippians was the war itself and not the cause of the war. So I want to read to you from Sumner's speech on the floor of the House in April of 1864. And then I want to read a section from the centennial booklet that Ross Barnett published in the spring of 1961 to commemorate 100 years of Civil War and secession. So I have to put on my glasses. I have to find my spot.
Do you need a cough drop?
That's a good idea.
Okay. That's part of being a good host, is just looking after
You're a great guy, man.
Thank you.
But this is not going to go on that long, Cecil. All right. So Sumner is standing on the floor of the House. Both the North and the South should gather up the glories won by each section, not envious but proud of each other. Let us hope that future generations, when they remember the deeds of heroism and devotion done on both sides, will speak not of Northern prowess and Southern courage, but of the heroism, fortitude, and courage of Americans in a war of ideas. 100 years later, this paragraph from the Centennial Booklet: if any one goal is paramount in this commemorative undertaking, it is to inform all people that there was dedication to ideals and honest beliefs on both sides, North and South. What Lamar was able to do was to create a reunion between white Northerners and white Southerners. And in doing that, divorced from the Civil War and Reconstruction the role of black men, women, and children. And pretty soon they were forgotten. that when we were growing up, when all of our ancestors were growing up in Mississippi, when we thought about the reunion, it was a reunion of white people. It was a reunion of white soldiers and white Northerners who fought for what they believed was right. And nobody, Marshall, ever admitted one side was wrong. But in the course of that, the former slaves were all forgotten, and they were set aside, and the war became about beliefs and ideas and not about slavery. And that was LQC Lamar. He was successful in that for 90 years in creating what became this culture in the South. And it was done, I don't think necessarily to make white people feel good about losing the war. It was done to divorce from the war and Reconstruction the cause of black men, women, and children so that they could be forgotten about and they could be moved into third and fourth and fifth class status over the course of Jim Crow so that their plight did not matter. If you read these 40 pages in this book commemorating the Civil War, there's not one mention of a black person. Not even the word, of course they didn't use black back then, not even the word Negro, not even the word slave, nothing about 4 million Americans who were at the center of the war in 1861 were forgotten about. And that is the central story, I think, of Reconstruction, to try and bring back to the beginning of what we should learn about it is that it's about freedom. It's about what it means to be free in America, and it's about the way that the message of the war controlled what we all thought in Mississippi for 90 years. We should never let that happen again.
Thank you, Jere. That's fantastic. We have time for questions. We do have time for a few questions. If anybody step up, I don't remember the process because it's been a month since I've done this. So,
if you could just repeat the question from the audience member so we can hear it.
making me work. Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. Just say it loud enough for me to hear it, and I'll repeat the question. Yes, sir.
Jere Ramsey.
Yes, sir.
Great book, Jere.
Thank you.
The way you dealt with sources is phenomenal. I also agree with you that freedom is the central theme, with the focus on voting and the focus on being involved with the process. I want to ask a different kind of question. Given all what you've said, I read your book, fantastic, with the documents you looked at in terms of the convention, stuff that happened after the convention, with the whole issue of Jim Crow that came later. And this is one of these questions you probably can't answer, but given the fact that, say, forget about Johnson for a moment, but even Grant, when he was general and when he became president, if he had decided to, say, prosecute seriously, bring some of these former Confederacy to trial, including the Ku Klux Klan, and had them hung if they were convicted, could Mississippi be in a different place today?
So just to repeat, his question was basically, would Mississippi be in a different place if both either Johnson or Grant had brought them to trial and the people from the Confederacy and possibly, made them pay for what they did? Fair?
So another reason to come to Oxford, Mississippi, Roy, is that in 1864, December of 1874, Grant had to send troops to Vicksburg to quell what would have turned into a massacre there, where white Democrats tried to take over the county by murdering whomever they needed to kill. And Grant recognized what was happening and sent troops to stop that. The next time that troops ever came to Mississippi was right here in September of 1962, obviously. So that is a shorthand answer to your question, which is only federal troops were going to create an environment in Mississippi that allowed something other than Jim Crow to evolve. The hold on the political process by white Democrats was too strong, and it was going to take a longer time for this coalition of black and white Republicans to sort of get their feet under the ground. I mean, they had a great start for 5 years, from 70 to 75, but obviously you're starting from scratch and you need a longer time. It would have taken 20 or 30 years of federal troop presence in Mississippi to allow and nurture that coalition to maturity, which was never going to happen.
And so we are what we are.
We are what we are.
Thank you.
Jamie?
Jamie Barnett, thanks for this great book that I look forward to reading. I was one of the students who was taught the Bettersworth Mississippi history the year before integration was actually enforced in Mississippi. I was a junior at Ole Miss when I walked across campus over the Daily Mississippian and read about the lawsuit of Salas and Lowen against the Mississippi Textbook Commission. Went to Mississippi, the Ole Miss bookstore, bought the textbook, and learned for the first time that my hometown, Clinton, Mississippi, there had been one of those massacres.
Right.
You know, scores of African Americans dragged out and killed, hundreds, and you know, it changed my whole view of historical revisionism. I'm teaching a course now out at Ole Miss. I have a student from Clinton who's never heard of the Clinton massacre.
Right.
So what is it that we do? Because it looks like we're in the same place.
Well, Clinton needs to buy my book, obviously. You and I could have this conversation for a very long time, but I would, and this is way off the radar, but you know, they teach Mississippi history now in the 8th grade, which I don't think anybody gets that. And I think it ought to be taught in the 12th grade. At least a senior has a much better chance of grasping the kind of ideas. But Marshall said something that I also want to say is Reconstruction or populism or civil rights should never be taught as sort of date, event, people. It should be thematic, because nobody is going to remember Adelbert Ames, or nobody is going to remember J.Z. George or any of those names in their role in Reconstruction. But, you know, they might remember, you know, Reconstruction was about freedom, and we talk about freedom all the time, and we celebrated July the 4th, and that might stick with somebody. And that they had to go through a ride in Vicksburg and a ride in Clinton and a ride in Meridian, and to sort of get there. I just think it needs to be taught in a different way at a different time. I do. Any other thoughts or comments? Since you talked about students, I wanted to end with, if that's okay, do we have time for an ending?
Yeah.
My favorite anecdote that I came across in writing the book, Marshall, was about Blanche Bruce. Blanche Bruce was the first black U.S. senator to serve a full term. Think about this, from 1789, the beginning of the latest Constitution in America, to 1964, 1789, 1964, only 2 black men served in the U.S. Senate. They were both from Mississippi. Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce. They both were appointed by the legislature during Reconstruction. Hiram Revels served a year and a half, finished a term, and Blanche Bruce served a full 6-year term. At the time that we began the book in 1862, Blanche Bruce was an enslaved man on a farm in Kansas, eventually got his freedom, worked his way to Bolivar County, and then got elected to the legislature and was appointed U.S. Senator. Took office in the spring of 1875. And his biographer captured one of the great excuses for taking 10 years, Marshall, to write a book is I could wait for all these great resources to come my way. And if I had written the book in the first year after getting the contract, I would not have been able to take advantage of the biography of Blanche Bruce and his family. But the biographer had captured this great scene on the floor of the U.S. Senate in the spring of 1875. When Bruce was on the floor of the Senate to get sworn in as the U.S. Senator from Mississippi. And just sort of think back or think sort of aloud to yourself, if you can, perceive the situation in 1875 in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol. Blanche Bruce is the only black person on the floor of the U.S. Senate, surrounded by all of the other U.S. senators. There are a few black family members allowed in the gallery, but it's jam-packed with other whites there for this historic occasion. Staff is lined around the floor of the Senate. And Bruce is the only black man on the floor. And the time comes for him to be sworn in. The clerk calls his name and he stands up. And the tradition at the time is that the state's senior senator then meets the junior senator in the aisle, walks him to the well of the Senate to be sworn in. The state's senior senator at the time, James Alcorn, was on the other side of the aisle. The clerk calls Bruce's name. He stands up, Marshall, and looks across the chamber, looking for Alcorn to stand up and come. And Alcorn is reading a newspaper like this. And Bruce just stands there. The clerk calls his name again. And Alcorn is just reading the newspaper. So Bruce, exhibiting as much courage as any person you could think of, sort of ambles through the aisle and begins walking down the center aisle all by himself. And about halfway down the aisle, he feels a little tug on his arm. And he looks down and stands up Roscoe Conklin. And he says, "Mr. Bruce, my name is Roscoe Conklin. I am the senior senator from New York, and it would be my honor and privilege to escort you to the aisle to receive the swearing in," which he does. When Blanche Bruce and his wife have their first son, they name him Roscoe Conklin Bruce. He goes on to Harvard, becomes one of the first black graduates from Harvard, was an honor graduate. And I like to tell that story to students because it really only takes one person to defy peer pressure. It only takes one person to sort of stand up to conventional wisdom, to do the, quote, right thing, and you can make a difference. You don't need a lot of people. And Roscoe Conklin made a difference that day, and Bruce talked about it for the rest of his life and mentored him in the U.S. Senate. It only takes one, and there are a lot of those in the book that where people exhibited courage that we'll never have to confront, and we're all the better for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jere Nash. Thank you, Jere.
Thank you.